Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Pilot Lawyer Podcast. Thank you for your attention while this important legal information is reviewed. What you hear should not replace consultation with an attorney and should not be considered advice for your situation. On behalf of the Pilot Lawyer and your entire crew, it's our pleasure to have you aboard.
Welcome, aviators, to the Pilot Lawyer Podcast with us, the Eisen brothers at the Eisen Law Firm, where aviation law is all we do, nothing else. You're here for what we do best, navigating the FAA medical certification process for pilots and those who want to become pilots. And, of course, if you don't laugh, you cry. And for the next 30 minutes, we hope to bring you the lighter side of what can otherwise be a frustrating process. So, whether you are laughing at us or with us, join us brothers as we discuss the fascinating world of FAA medical certification. All right, gents, who we got here today?
Well, I like to note that you're not a lawyer.
Yeah.
So don't be out there portraying yourself, UPLing. You're not a lawyer.
I was thinking as he was reading that intro, this doesn't sound like an individual skilled in the oratory fine arts of the law.
Hey.
Let us do some talking for you.
Okay.
Anywho, why don't you introduce yourself?
This is Anthony Eisen, pilot lawyer number 1, the big cheese.
Why don't you introduce myself?
I'm not redoing that intro.
Christopher Eisen, the lesser cheese.
And the leastest cheese.
Wooly bully.
Dr. Alex Eisen.
Wooly bully.
Wooly moly.
So what we're here to talk about today is veterans of the U.S. military and their receipt of disability benefits from the Department of Veterans Affairs and how that affects their eligibility to hold an airman medical certificate with the Federal Aviation Administration, as well as some rather difficult ramifications that we are seeing actively and rampant in the FAA at this point in time.
I don't even know why this is an issue because my AME says you don't have to put down the VA disability benefits on the FAA Form 8500 application for medical certificate. So this better be worth my time.
So you're saying you went to your AME and they said, hey, listen, man, don't tell them. Come in close. Don't tell them about your post-traumatic stress disorder, the 30% you get for that. Don't tell the FAA about your obstructive sleep apnea, your rhinitis, your tinnitus, or your 1099s. Just don't tell them anything.
This is in this fictitious situation, since I'm not a veteran.
It shows.
Let's say I went to my AME and he did tell me all that. Because in my thought process, as the veteran here in this scenario, when I discharged from the military, I was told that this was not disability benefits, but this was service-connected compensation.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what's going to happen. You're going to be going along fat, dumb, and happy, receiving your monthly check or direct deposit.
Definitely fat and dumb.
Definitely. Depression will be another episode. Yeah. Nevertheless, we got this situation here where the VA and the FAA have gotten their heads together.
Bum, bum, bum.
And under VA statutes or regulations, I should say, the VA has the authority to share information relative to disability benefits and applications with the FAA. And so what has been happening lately, there has been a special project generated at the FAA wherein the FAA is cross-referencing this database of information from the VA with those airmen who haven't identified their VA disability benefits on their medical applications at question 18Y and other relevant questions.
So you're saying I got to put it down to 18Y and other questions under block 18?
That's right. So block 18, the relevant question is 18Y. In your lifetime, have you received medical disability benefits? Which the FAA believes that your VA disability benefits are what? What? They are disability benefits.
Disability what?
That's right. So disability benefits. And as a result, they should be reported 18Y, and then the underlying conditions for which you receive the benefits should be elsewhere identified on the application. For example, PTSD let's say you have 30% for a PTSD. You know what that's going to be? 18Y and 18M for mental health conditions. Obstructive sleep apnea. There's a trick question. 18Y and 18X for other disabilities, illnesses, or surgeries.
What about my traumatic brain injury?
Oh, that's a tricky one. 18Y, 18X perhaps, or question about neurological disorders. Is it a neurological disorder? Hard to say if you've got these other issues born out of the TBI.
I suppose if you had a TBI, there may have been a possibility you've lost consciousness at one point.
Lost consciousness. Maybe you got migraine
Look
headaches.
at this guy. He's paying attention.
Yeah,
Right.
migraine headaches.
Right?
So, yeah, we're proud of you. And so,
Dizziness.
we can clap you off the show now because you brought one interesting piece of
What about a
information.
seizure?
Listen, this is
Subsequent
my
to a
time to
TBI.
shine. Okay? Don't be stepping in
I had
on my
something relevant
sunshine.
to speak about, okay?
Seizures, sure.
I got it.
If you've had some level of midline shift or something along those lines, within the past 5 years, typically the FAA feels like there's a risk for increased seizure.
I do what now?
Increased seizure following a TBI within the past 5 years, typically.
Well, let me ask you this question, because this seems to be quite prevalent in our practice. Let's say, in this case, again, I'm the fictitious veteran, and I got this bad information from my AME, or I got it from some other pilot vet who instructed me how to handle this issue on the 8500, or I just didn't think about my VA disability benefits being relevant to any question on the 8500. And now, hearing this podcast or reading the wonderful blogs on the pilotlawyer.com, I realize the error of my ways. Is there a way for me to fix it before it's too late and the FAA finds out?
Please, for everything that's holy, do an amendment.
What's that?
Okay. Settle in, baby. If you haven't reported your VA disability benefits on
SWAT's
your
gonna-
medical application,
Listen, don't interrupt the man. The man's on a thought.
the podcast people are going to have to go in and cut all that out because you've talked over me.
I was trying to implicate that SWAT's going to kick your door in because
SWAT's not, I can maybe prevent SWAT. Let me tell you. Jeez.
Sit there, look pretty.
Or just sit there.
Yes, sir.
So I haven't reported my VA disability benefits. Here's what I'm going to do. I would potentially call someone that's competent and knows what they're talking about, such as ourselves. Even though we may not sound competent right now, please call us. We're happy to discuss this with you. Nevertheless, don't go to your AME and say, hey, listen, buddy or ma'am, I just need to tell you about these VA disability benefits. And if they say, oh, well, we'll just put it on your next application, everything will be fine. Run. Because what's going to happen is essentially there you're providing a correct
admission.
response to your current application, which could then be used as an admission to prove that you acknowledge that you should be saying yes to this question and not fixing the old applications. What instead needs to happen, we need to have a manifestation of your intent or your desire to modify and amend your previous applications. Well, how do I go about doing that?
Previous and relevant.
Previous and relevant. I may have had applications beforehand that don't require amendment. Kind sir, how do I go about doing this? Well, the FAA is not going to put out some beautiful little process by which to amend your applications, because otherwise you just have everybody pencil whipping their answers and say, I'll fix that later after when I feel like it.
Once I've been issued my medical and then it's after the 60 days.
Never
and
going to
the
happen.
AMA can't do anything about
so
it.
they just don't publish a policy. In our practice, however, we have been very successful with going to the FAA and amending applications before the FAA contacts the airman and say, hey, listen, I want to amend my applications to reflect this history of receiving disability benefits for these conditions.
You seem to kind of stress that point there before the FAA contacts the airman. Why is that significant?
If the
Or am I just reading into the inflection of your tone?
Well, I didn't know you knew how to read.
I saw something in his eye that gave it away to me.
A
I've only
glimmer.
got the
A
good
glimmer.
one. That being said, if you wait for the FAA to contact you, one, is probably too late to do anything to salvage your career. And then beyond that, that will be used as an admission. An amendment will only work if the FAA hasn't contacted you first. Now, let's say you do an amendment, everything's gravy. What is intended to happen is the FAA will essentially come back and say, hey, thanks for letting us know about this. Now we need additional information to establish your eligibility to hold a medical certificate. And then you'll go through the process to establish your medical eligibility, which in most cases are very doable, may require a little bit of legwork to establish your eligibility. But PTSD, obstructive sleep apnea, traumatic brain injury are all conditions which can be issued a medical certificate if handled appropriately.
This is all just fascinating. Let me ask you this question. What if the FAA has found out about my receipt of VA disability benefits and the fact that I didn't disclose it on my previous applications for a medical certificate and has contacted me? What options am I looking at?
What did they
ramifications?
say? What did they say when they contacted
Well, I mean, what does the federal government say to you when they come knocking on the door?
Has your FAA medical certificate been denied? Are you concerned you may not be able to get a medical certificate from the FAA? Are you at risk for FAA action for failing to report your medical history appropriately? Call the pilot lawyer at 1-855-FAA-1215 to discuss your options for getting the FAA to issue your medical certificate and get you flying. We are happy to evaluate your case and discuss with you a plan for presenting your case to the AME or the FAA. Aviation law is all we do, nothing else.
Yeah, well, the federal government could do one of two things. Actually, three things. They could literally knock on your door. The Department of Transportation Office Inspector General could potentially come to your door, or the VA Office Inspector General. In certain cases, they have pursued criminal action against airmen who haven't appropriately reported their VA disability benefits on their medical application. If you're listening to this, I don't necessarily want you to lay in bed tonight worrying about that piece. Those are relatively far and few between instances. Sure, they could happen, and you need to rush to the nearest competent individual to do an amendment if you haven't reported this. However, that's not a very common occurrence. More commonly, we'll see one of two things. The FAA could send you a letter of investigation, wherein they're investigating this process to establish whether or not you provided an intentionally false answer on your medical application. And as a result, that could potentially and very easily turn into a situation where the FAA intends and pursues revocation of your airman certificates and medical certificate. If you're a weekend warrior, that may not be as big of a deal, but if you're a career pilot, this could be catastrophic to your career and to your livelihood. Furthermore, there's an option where the FAA may say, hey, we'll give you what's known as a letter of correction. A letter of correction is essentially where the FAA says, hey, listen, buddy or madam, we are going to give you an opportunity to fix your applications, but we're also going to establish whether or not you're eligible to hold your medical by way of asking for various records, evaluations, and so on. Just because the letter of correction exists doesn't indicate that you should just wait for that to happen and not amend your application if you haven't reported your disability benefits to the FAA.
So you're saying that it's better to get ahead of it while you can, as opposed to waiting for the FAA to come knocking on the door.
You know what? Your headphones must work because you are listening.
Yes. I don't know about this guy over here. He's been awfully quiet.
No.
Yeah. I mean, you going to add anything to this, or should we cut your mic?
Hey, last time I tried to add something, I got yelled at, so I'm just sitting here looking pretty.
Now, that sounds like a you problem at home, not an us problem.
Whoa.
Yeah, be that as it may. So be proactive. Tell the FAA about it if you need to. If they've come to you, at what point do you respond to them, and how do you respond to them, and should you get us involved, and et cetera, et cetera?
I would recommend getting us involved as soon as possible, or another attorney. Not to go on a diatribe, but
A diet?
a diatribe.
I don't go on any kind of diets. It shows.
Obviously.
Obvious. That being said, do you want to have a doctor handling a legal matter or an attorney handling a legal matter?
That's a mighty bold statement. You prepared to back that up?
I would argue that the whole entire medical certification before the Federal Aviation Administration is a legal process. All right, here's why. We're not using the DSM standards. We're not using real world medicine. We're assessing, the FAA is assessing risk based off of their criteria within the regulations.
They're regulatory criteria.
That is correct.
And what is regulatory? Another word for?
Regulation.
Which is another word for?
Law. The law.
Man, you'd almost think this was scripted. It's not.
It's not. It's not. A law firm can offer a legal understanding of the process with respect to the regulatory application to the facts being what the doctors create. That is the evidence. That being said, with respect to amending the VA disability benefits on your medical application, the letters of correction, letters of investigation, that is a legal process because the letter of investigation would lend itself to potentially going into litigation before the NTSB. The letter of correction, the same situation with respect to your medical eligibility. They could deny you, and that may need to be appealed.
Plus, anything that you're saying in response to those is potentially going to be an admission.
It's an admission, baby.
Yeah. So why would you have a doctor handling a legal problem?
So let me ask you this. Have you had any cases where people have lost their certificates because of VA disability benefits not being reported on their medical certificates, medical applications?
Many a case, and we've tried at least one case, maybe more than that.
Well, we've litigated, but actually had to try.
Went to trial on
Yeah,
one.
a lot of them, they don't go to trial because the cases are relatively difficult to prove, especially
Defend.
difficult to defend. That's right.
Easy to prove.
Easy to prove, difficult to defend. How would the FAA prove a case like that? Essentially, they would get documentation from the VA showing that you've received the benefits or received the monetary income for the conditions, and then prove that you had knowledge of the falsity just through the circumstantial evidence of the fact that you were receiving the monetary intake. So that's why a letter correction, if you find yourself in a spot where you've received a letter of investigation, you have to work like the Dickens, baby, to try to get this turned over to a letter of correction, because a letter of correction won't have the ramification of revocation of all your airman certificates. It'll purely be about whether or not you're eligible to hold a medical certificate at that point.
So you're saying that there's a lesser of the evils where you don't lose your airman certificates, your ATP, and all your type ratings or your commercial certificate or anything like that, but it's just looked at purely from a standpoint of, am I medically eligible to hold a certificate?
That's correct. That's in the letter correction situation or in the potential opportunity for you to amend your application before the FAA contacts you.
But if you get a letter of investigation, you're going to be fighting tooth and nail to try and get a letter of correction instead of going to enforcement, at which point they're looking at revoking all of your certificates.
That's correct.
Man.
Intricate.
Detailed.
Sounds awfully legal to me.
Let me say this piece, though. Let's say you're getting out of the military and you need to transition to civilian flying. Doesn't mean you can't take any benefits from the VA. Essentially, the question is, and a lot of these situations or however you want to phrase the question, is the condition for which you're receiving benefits aeromedically significant? So a lot of times client will call up and say, hey, listen, buddy, we have a situation here where I'm afraid to tell the FAA about my VA disability benefits because I need this income from the disability benefits in order to maintain my livelihood and so on. So if I tell the FAA about these benefits, am I going to lose my VA disability benefits? Well, we don't handle the VA side of things, but I can tell you, dealing with many, many veterans over the course of our career, we've never had a client that's called us up and said, hey, listen, I've lost my VA disability benefits because of being able to establish my medical eligibility. Almost all of the time, we have to present this to the FAA totally above board to say, hey, listen, here's what I've told the VA, here's what my medical records reveal, and so on. I'm not denying that I have this condition per se, and sort of, or that I never had this condition, such as PTSD. Yeah, sure, maybe I had it, maybe I have it. Obstructive sleep apnea, maybe I had it. The question is, do I have it now? And if I have it now, is it aeromedically significant? If not, is there a way to mitigate the concern with respect to the condition? So there's a lot of opportunity to also hold an airman medical certificate in addition to receiving your VA disability benefits.
Well, I see the airport in sight. Let's get ready to land this puppy. Got any parting thoughts, final thoughts there?
My parting thoughts are as such. If you are receiving VA disability benefits and you haven't told the FAA, you need to get an amendment out ASAP. If you've received a letter of correction or a letter of investigation, you need to call an attorney and discuss that issue as soon as you possibly can.
Lickety split.
Lickety, lickety split. For all those veterans out there, we certainly thank you for your service, and we don't want to see you lose your opportunity to be successful in civilian aviation. And it's not something that has to prevent you from being successful in civilian aviation.
Well, I think that concludes another successful podcast here with the pilot
Successful?
lawyer. What would you call it?
A podcast?
What we're going to talk about on the next podcast?
That's a beautiful question.
Crickets.
I don't even know. But we're going to come back with something so unbelievably beautiful that you won't even be able to enjoy yourself listening to it. Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't.
Wrap her
Well,
up.
you've logged another uneventful half hour listening to the
It
Pilot
hasn't
Lawyer
quite been
podcast.
a half hour, just so you know.
Well,
It's only been about 23
you've
minutes.
logged however long this podcast is.
And by the time they cut out all the stuff that we
we
shouldn't have
probably
said,
got 15 minutes.
if that. But be that
Okay.
as it may,
Well, you've logged another uneventful
period of time.
period of time listening to the Pilot Lawyer podcast. And even though our wives deny they know us in public, we are the Eisen brothers of the Eisen Law Firm. We'll see you next time. Good day.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.